Good evening. This will be part 3 of the series that we've been discussing in regard to Joshua and the Israelites going into Canaan and taking Jericho. And before I start this part 3, I want to correct a mistake that I made toward the end of part 2 in regard to the women and children that came out of Egypt being able to go into Canaan. If you'll recall, as the children of Israel came out of Egypt and they crossed the Red Sea, and then they eventually made their way to Kadesh Barnea. And while they were there in Kadesh Barnea, Moses sent 12 spies into the land. And you know, we discussed it in that part, that when those 12 spies came back after 40 days being in the land of Canaan, 10 of them was very strongly opposed to going into and taking the land, and so they were trying to convince the people that we don't need to be doing that. Joshua and Caleb, on the other hand, were all for going in because their position was, with God's help, they could do anything. But the people, the men, chose not to go in. And as a result of that, God's anger was kindled. And that's when he made the statement that not everyone was going to be able to go into the land of Canaan. In fact, the matter is, as you can see in this text that I've got on the screen right now, this is Numbers 32, verses 10 and 11, and I'll read it so you can follow along. It says, "And the Lord's anger was kindled, and he sware, saying, Surely none of the men that came up out of Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land, which I swear unto Abraham and unto Isaac and unto Jacob, because they have not wholly followed me, except for," and then he talks about Joshua and Caleb. So it's plainly stated there that it was the men only that came up out of Egypt 20 years old and older that would die during the 40 years that they wandered in the wilderness. So therefore, it's very possible that there were some folks there camped at Abel Shittim before they were ready to go down into Canaan that were almost 60. If they would have been 19 years old when they came out of Egypt, they would not be included in that bunch because it said 20 and older. So it could very well have been that there were some elderly people, and the women too, since it specifically talks about the men. I wanted to get that straightened out before we go any further. Not long after I'd said that, as I was recording this, you just get this thought: you've said something wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was, and so I decided to do a little looking and correct it, and that's what I hope I've done. Did not mean to mislead you. I just misspoke. And there's another thing that I want to make clear as well. That time, you'll recall that I mentioned that they had wandered in the wilderness for a while, and eventually they made their way to Abel Shittim, and they spent 12 or 15 years there. We talked about that. Some say it's a little longer than that, some less. But that 12 or 15 years that they spent there at Shittim was not in addition to the 40 years of wandering. By that I mean they didn't wander for 40 years and then camp there at Shittim for 12 or 15 years before they went into Canaan. That would have been 52 or so years at least that they wandered, and that isn't the way it was. So the 12, whatever time it was, 12 or 15 or 20, some people say it's more than that. at Shittim, that's all included in the 40 years of wandering. And we're going to see that when we get to the end of this part, or maybe it'll be in part 4, exactly when they came in and how long they had been gone and been wandering, and I think you'll see that. There's one thing, though, that is kind of interesting that I'd like to talk about before we go too much further into this part, and it has to do with that Exodus. The Jewish people, the Jewish community, do not view the story of the wandering in the wilderness the same way that you and I do. In spite of what's recorded, and in spite of the passages that tell us where they were and when they were there, you know, they made 22 different stops at different places during that 40 years time, but the Jewish community do not believe that. The Jewish community takes the stand that when the Israelites got to Kadesh Barnea, and I put a map up on the screen for you to see. It's a similar one to what we've been using, except I have expanded it so it takes in a greater area, and I've relabeled some of the things so that there includes a little bit more than just a few colored dots. But you will see right under the land of Canaan, a little ways, a red 4-pointed star. That is Kadesh Barnea. That is where the 12 spies left from and went into Canaan to spy out that land for 40 days. And that's where they came back to. The Jewish community takes the position that when those spies came back and it was decided that they would not go into Canaan, the Jewish community believes they stayed camped there at Kadesh Barnea for anywhere from 23 to 28 years. It depends again on which rabbi that you listen to. But they say because Kadesh Barnea was more or less what we would call an oasis. There was plenty of water there, and they could have their cattle and their flocks, and could pretty much carry on a good living style there in Kadesh Barnea. And so they left Kadesh Barnea after, let's say, 28 years, and then they marched directly over to Shittim, where they stayed for another period of time to make up the 40 years. Well, the scriptures do not bear that out. The scriptures list multiple stops that they made, and there's just more to it than that. And I think we need to believe what the scriptures say. At least I think we need to adhere to the scriptures as opposed to what some men think. I'm not trying to belittle the Jewish community at all. They just believe differently than we do in regard to that. Now, in part 2, I promised to show you some photographs of the ruins of old Jericho. And so before continuing the story too far, I want to do that. I'm going to do it by showing you the next few images from Google Earth that more or less sets the stage for the photographs that we're going to see a little bit later. This particular slide that you're looking at here, now I put all the labeling that's on there with Photoshop. So what I did is I eliminated there in Google Earth all of the labels and the borders and the roads and the photographs and things like that that are posted on Google Earth. I eliminated all those, so all we can see would be a clear map of the land, and then I, with Photoshop, added the labeling. Now, the reason I'm saying all of that is because without the labeling, you would be able to see the condition of the land or the situation of the land. You notice pretty much all of it is gray or tan, or it's a arid, desolated place. Now, desolated doesn't mean it isn't inhabited. It is. There's towns all around in there, but the only green places you see are the land of Goshen and Canaan, and then a little bit up in the Amorite area above the plains of Moab. This particular photograph was a screenshot from Google Earth, and I had zoomed the camera in to where what we're seeing is from a camera position 900 miles above the earth, and it's looking straight down to provide the image that we did. Now I want to advance this one time, and believe it or not, I did not move the camera as far as moving it from left to right or up and down. I just simply lowered the camera height, which brings up or kind of zooms in the picture to this particular elevation. And I think you'll recognize this slide because it's the one that we've used several times to put the colored dots on and things like that. This is from an altitude of 200 miles. That is to say, it's zoomed to the point to where if the camera were 200 miles above the earth, this is what you would see. And since there is no labeling on there, I think you would recognize it anyway from part 2, but I have pointed out where Jericho is. And now I want to show you the same slide zoomed in to 60 miles. And the reason that I'm doing that is because this is to show you the ruins that are there in the city of Jericho. I'm going to, well, I might have messed up here. My intention is in the next slide to get me way over out of the way where I don't interfere with the picture, and I'm hoping I do that. Yes, I did. So this is the ruins. I've put a red circle around them so that you can see them easily, and I'm going to move that circle over because I want to show you the relative size of that. So I'm going to move it over a little bit and put some labeling on there that shows the size. If you can see it well, you'll see that it's the same thing moved over, but I put a red and a yellow line on there. The red line measures the length of the ruins as best I can make it point to them. And that comes out to 1,148 feet. And then I drew a yellow line to show the width, and I tried to get it at the widest point. And that is 512 feet long. And so the city was not a large city. As a matter of fact, by today's standards, it would just be a very, very small little hamlet. But back then, things weren't like they are now. But to give you an even better idea of just how small it was, I then rotated the camera to get over Fort Smith. And then I zoomed it in to where the camera is actually only 1 mile high. I think you'll recognize the area that we're looking at there. This is the area in which the Park Hill Church of Christ building is located. In fact, I'll put some labeling on there where you can see it. That's the Park Hill building, and then I drew a rectangle that is 1,148 feet long. It turned out I could not make one 1,148 feet, but I could make one 1,150 feet. So this red rectangle is 1,150 feet, be 2 feet short of the size of those ruins, or the original Jericho. And the width of it is 510 feet as opposed to 512. So it's a little narrower as well. But as you'll see, I anchored it in the upper left-hand corner there of the red rectangle, right on the corner of the Park Hill property. And the red line on the left-hand side of the screen goes right down our property line, which is that ditch, just on the other side of that ditch that runs along there. I call it a ditch. It's concreted in, and I guess it's a canal. But look at the size of that. That's the entire city of Jericho as it was at the time that Joshua took the city. Now, I've tried to find what the population of Jericho was, and there just isn't apparently any way for me to find that out. And so the only research that I can come up with is two extremes. There's one extreme is there are people, historians and scholars that believe that the city may have had as many as 5,000 people living there. Seems a lot to me in such a small area, but maybe so. The other extreme, excuse me, the other extreme is that there were only maybe 300 people that were living there. And again, that seems a little small, but I just don't know what the population of it was. But now back to the city of Jericho. Instead of looking at a Google Earth screenshot of the ruins there, I found a photograph, a literal photograph that was taken by a tourist, and I'm not sure, it wasn't clear to me whether he took this picture. He was riding one of those those overhead tram things, and he may have taken the photograph from that. If not, I don't know how he obtained it. But anyway, it's a pretty good picture of pretty close up, and you can even see some of the excavations that have been made there in the ruins there. I was quite surprised. You'll notice around the ruins, especially on the north side, there's a lot of lush green shrubbery and things. Those are actually palm trees, by the way. Not all of them, but some of them. The city of Jericho had a second name. It was called the City of the Palms. And there was up above the city as it existed back then, and it's still there working as a artesian well. There was a spring or something that provided a year-round supply of water that ran right through the city, or right around the city, and they had whatever you do to divert that and get it to come into the city. So they had a good supply of water, and because of the lush greenery that we see, they still have a good supply of the water. Well, the photographs that I promised to show you. In the upper left, there's 4 here, of course. All of them are of the ruins except one. The photo just above me, the top left-hand photo, is said to be one of the walls of Rahab's house. I don't know how they would know that. I doubt they found a red cord hanging from it, but it may have been. For certain, it's one of the houses. It's what's left of one of the houses that was between the 2 walls, between the outer wall and the inner wall. And the thing I find interesting about it is you notice the foundation of it is packed rocks. I don't know what that is. That some kind of mortar, maybe mud, that holds the rocks in place. And then there's a difference from the ground level up, a different kind of material. And again, I don't know what that is. But if it is Rahab's house, or if it's not, it's one of the structures that was between the 2 walls. The top center photograph, the one that's got the man standing there, that's supposed to be one of the archaeologists. I have no way of knowing. I got these photographs, by the way, off of the Jericho website, tourist website thing. And I don't know if he's one of the archaeologists or not, but that's what is said about the photograph, and that he is posed there by one of the by the section of the inner wall, and that wall was estimated to have been about 30 feet tall. And as you can see, assuming he's a 6 foot tall guy, that the wall that's there is probably 18, 20 feet or so, maybe a little higher. So wouldn't surprise me at all that that wall was 30 feet high. I've read some of the descriptions of the old city, and the way they show it, some of those walls were even higher than 30 feet. But I think they may have been talking about the towers. I think I showed you a model that was there in Jericho for the tourists to see, and I took the photograph of it. I didn't take the photograph of it. Someone took the photograph of it, and I found it there on their website. And but the wall, the outer wall, had 16 towers around it, and they were there equally spaced, pretty much around the wall, as kind of anchor points for the wall, like posts that we would use today. But that top right photograph is one of those towers that has been rebuilt. They don't say that they actually used the old material. It just says that it has been rebuilt to show the tourists just how high that tower really was. That tower is 50 feet high. And you can kind of see, it's a little difficult, but you can kind of see that the material changes as it goes up. But there were 16 of those towers that were around the wall. Most of them were 30 foot high. But there were 4 towers that were 50 foot high, and 2 on the inner wall and 2 on the outer wall. And they were the anchor points for the big gate. I don't know if it was 2 gates or 1 big gate, but there was only one way in or out of the city, and that was through that gate, or through the inner gate and then through the outer gate. When those gates were locked, it was virtually impregnable, and that's the way it was. Now, the lower right hand photograph, the one just directly across from me, is one of the smaller walls that was between the two walls. There are no walls left of the old city in the center, in the inner wall, inside the inner wall. Those, the weather, erosion, I don't know everything that happened to them, but they just all kind of crumbled together. They claim it was an earthquake, but of course, as you and I know, and it could be, I guess, that God caused an earthquake to happen when the people walked around Jericho. But they say that it was so badly destroyed that you couldn't tell one thing from the other, and I can understand that. But that's the photos that I had that I wanted you to see. And now this is the slide that we've been viewing for quite a while, and we were using it when we ended part 2. The Israelites are camped there where the white dot is. That white dot represents Abel Shittim, and the people have been there now for getting real close to say 15 years. It could be a little longer, a little less, but it's about time for them to go down into Canaan. And so Moses has died. As you recall, the last thing we talked about was Moses' death on Mount Nebo, which is 5 miles or so south of the white dot. In fact, Mount Nebo is that kind of a darker area you see just below the red dot. And so Moses is not there. He has passed the baton, if you will, over to Joshua, and Joshua is getting prepared to go down into Canaan. He calls his officers together, and he tells them to go spread the word. That is, those officers were to go through the camp, the entire camp, and let everyone know that they needed to prepare for leaving. And he told them to get their victuals together, which means while they're traveling, they won't be able to prepare meals and things, so they are to do whatever preparation that they need to make because they are going to leave in 3 days. And so there's plenty of time for them to do that. He also calls together the Reubenites and the Gadites and half of the tribe of Manasseh. As you remember, we talked about them. They are the ones that have decided to settle on the eastern side, on the side that we're on before going into Canaan. They found that the land is pretty good, and they had overcome the Ammonites and some of the Moabites in the northern regions of Moab, and even some of the Amorites had some land in there. And Joshua and his people, or at that time it was Moses and his people, had won those battles. And so those 2.5 tribes had decided to just settle there on the east side. When they made that decision to do that, Moses told them, you can do that, but, and that is, you must supply men ready to go to battle to help us take the country after we go into it. So Joshua is calling those people together, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. And he tells them that the women and children can stay. And in fact, you can You can keep the cattle that you have, all of the children and all of the women, and all of the men even also can stay, and except for those that are going to go across with us. And that number was 40,000 men able to go to battle. And so he tells them, in 3 days, we're going to cross, and we're going to leave here, and you need to go with us. And they agree to do that. And so that part is set. The next thing that he does is he sends 2 spies into Jericho. And it was supposed to be secretly. We're not told how the spies got in, how they were identified as spies, how they were discovered as being there. We're simply told that it was known that they were there. And Rahab took them in, as you know, and one of the things that she said, that when those 2 spies get back to Joshua, and by the way, they get back within the 3-day period of time before Joshua leads the people. But Rahab told them that the people, the Canaanites, had heard about the God of Israel and the power that he had, and the battles that had been fought and won, and they were afraid of the Israelites. Now, we mentioned last time that maybe they might have been a few of them that climbed the western wall and looked across the valley. They're not going to have to do that now. So when we get to chapter 3 of the book of Joshua, it says, early in the morning, Joshua and all of the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing. Now, that phrase, all of the Israelites, that would be except for those Gadites and Reubenites and half of the tribe of Manasseh, the women and the children and the cattle. They all stayed there. So it's just the Israelites, except for those, plus 40,000 of their men that are ready to go to battle, that are going to be going across Canaan. I don't know how many that turns out to be, maybe 1 million. If we look at it from the conservative side, perhaps not. So, as it said in Joshua chapter 3, early in the morning, Joshua and all of the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing the river. And the white dot is going to show you, as best I can, probably the way that they went. We've been told that the red dot is where they started down the mountain. So if you'll watch the white dot, it will start moving around, and it travels down the mountain, and it gets directly across the river from Jericho. They do not cross the river. These million people, let's say, that were camped up on the top of the valley, now have packed their belongings and the tabernacle, I'm assuming, and taken it down the valley, and now they're camped maybe 3 or 4 miles directly across from Jericho. And they erect their camp because they're going to stay here 3 days. They were 3 days up on the valley preparing to come down. Now they're down, and they're going to stay 3 more days before they actually cross the river. And in order to get the proper understanding of this, uh, I think we need to get the setting. In Joshua chapter 4, verse 19, it tells us that the Israelites came up out of the Jordan after crossing it. Now, they haven't done that yet. They're still camped where the white dot is on the east side. But once they cross the river, then they'll be on the west side and be there near Jericho. But what chapter 4, verse 19 tells us is that after they came up out of the Jordan and had crossed the river, they did that on the 10th day of Nisan. That might mean something to you. It should, but you may have forgotten. Some of you might remember that I substituted for Brian when he was gone a couple of times. I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, maybe. Maybe not that long. I can't really remember. But in one of those classes, I think it was a Wednesday evening class, that I discussed the new beginnings that are recorded in Exodus chapter 12. And it has to do with the fact that the Exodus occurred at the very same time the very first Passover was observed. And they're tied together, so that's only normal that it would be that way. If you remember, God had told Moses that they needed to kill the sacrificial lamb, and they needed to spread the blood on the doorposts, because God was going to pass over the city, and God had promised that every firstborn would die. Now, that's not just firstborn people. That included the animals as well. God said every firstborn would die that night. That was the last plague, if you will, that was pronounced on Egypt. It was the final straw that made Pharaoh let the people go. And the night before that, before they left, they ate the Passover meal. And God said, "This shall be a new year for you." It is the beginning of years. Now, in actuality, this was the 3rd month, and it was about the 14th day of that month. And so when God made that statement, he said, "This is the beginning of years for you." So the year shifted. Now, instead of it being the 3rd month, it's the 1st month. So in the month of Nisan, which is the 1st month after that change that God made, on the 15th day of the month is the Passover. And so it is observed on what we would call the 14th, because remember, in the Jewish way of keeping time, the day doesn't start in the morning, the day starts in the evening. So the 15th actually started, the 15th day actually started at 6 o'clock on the evening of the 14th, the way we would count the time. It's a little confusing, but and so now we're told that when the Israelites cross the Jordan River, they come up out of the water on the 10th day of the month of Nisan. That means it's 5 days until Passover. Now, that's kind of important, because when they left Egypt, they left the day after the Passover. Now, the Passover marked the fact that they were free from bondage. And so each year, when Passover is observed, It is because they are celebrating that exodus from Egypt, that release from bondage, that release from slavery that there was. And so here now, where we're standing and looking at this map, the Israelites are camped just, I guess now it would be 8 days before the Passover, because they wait here 3 days, and when they come out, there's still 5 days yet for the Passover. So that would mean, if my math is correct, 8 days, it is the 9th day of the month of Nisan. Now, I've said all of that in order to say this. 40 years they wandered. This Passover that is about to occur, and they're going to eat it on the east side of the river. I mean, the west side of the river. They're going to cross over onto the same side that Jericho is on, and then eat the Passover over there. 40 years after. This is the 40th Passover after it's the 40th Passover. It began with them leaving Egypt. So the 40 years that God promised them to wander in the wilderness is just a few days shy of that. But it more accurately sets the time. Now, another thing that we need to consider before we close off this part is the river. The river, although it doesn't show it on the map that I've got displayed for you, the river is flowing mightily. It is the spring. The rains have come. And every spring, the Jordan fills and runs. This particular one may be a little more than the others. I don't know. But a lot of rain comes in the spring, and you know, we've had a whole lot of rain just within the last month or so here. And by the way, just so you might know this, the city of Jericho lies at 31.7 degrees north latitude. Now, there's no reason for you to remember that, but would you believe that the city of Fort Smith sits at 35.3 degrees north latitude? That means the city of Fort Smith is just a little further north than the city of Jericho. Now, that piqued my curiosity a little bit, so I did a search of how many cities in the United States lie on 31.7 degrees. And there probably are some, but none of them turned up. However, 2 cities turned up at 31.8, and one turned up at 31.8, and one turned up at 31.6. The one that's 31.8 is Waco, Texas. And I've been to Waco several times. When Joanne and I go down to the Padre Island or Mustang Island, which we like to do every year, we stay overnight in Waco 2 or 3 days. It's a beautiful city. It's a lush city. There's plenty of rain and greenery. So if you're not familiar with Waco, the other city is Charleston, South Carolina. It happens to be a coastal city, but it's on the very close to 31.7 degrees. So when the earth rotates, I know that climatic differences occur because of the mountain ranges and the temperatures and all of that, but essentially they're in the same zone, if you will, that we are. Now, because of that, and because of the spring rains and things, the river was swollen. And I tried to find some photographs of that, and the only one that I found is not here where Jericho is. I'll show it to you. But you can see from the mountain range and from the fact that there is not a very wide valley for the people to camp in. This must be further north, well above the city of Jericho. It may even be, I don't know, it may even be up above Adam. But as you can see, there's a lot of water running down that river. And that's what the Israelites are going to have to deal with when they cross it. Well, that's enough for this part 3. I've already done the research. I've already made the plans. It's just a matter of me sitting down in front of the camera and recording part 4. And that will be the end of it. And I will do that tomorrow if I possibly can. And y'all have a good night and hope to see you soon. Good evening.